Thank you for joining me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin and I'm so excited for this video because it's going to feature a highly anticipated fabric line that I've been looking forward to receiving since I heard it was coming out, and that is Tilda's Something Blue fabric line. And I happen to have a fat quarter bundle here and thought I would use this video to look at patterns that could really showcase the fabrics in this line. Of course, we're going to look at them in more depth, but I mentioned in an earlier video with my goals for this year that I wanted to slow down on buying fabric. And so when I saw this one, which came out in early June of 2026, I just couldn't help myself on this one. My favorite color combination is blue and white. I've made a few quilts that feature blue and white fabrics. They're some of my favorites. I have one that's made with Lewis and Irene's Tea Time fabric, and that one is from a book called Red and White Quilts, actually, featuring a pattern called Daydream by Camille Roskelly. And then I also made a blue and white quilt to go along with my little ghost who was a quilt book. And so that one was a quilt I made in the fall and had a video on how I made that too, but lots of blues and whites in there as well. I grew up in a town that had a Dutch heritage, and so I saw and was drawn to lots of pottery with blue and white, featuring windmills and clogs and tulips. And it's my understanding that the designer of this fabric line based it on her collection of ceramics, blue and white ceramics. And so it made me a little curious about some of the images in here. And so I'm going to talk about that a little more too when we look at this fabric in more depth. But this is a 20-piece fat quarter bundle. Fat quarters are approximately 18 by 22 inches. They are a half yard of fabric that are cut in half, hence the name fat quarters. And this particular collection has 13 blue fat quarters and 7 cream or kind of off-white fat quarters. And the blues range from darker to lighter blues, so you have a little bit of value fluctuation in there, which can be fun to play with as we look at some patterns that could work for this. But that's really the goal of this video, is to look at some patterns that I already have purchased and just think they would work wonderfully with this. I think I have 5 of those patterns. And then I also just looked online for free patterns. I found 11 free ones that I think would just look beautiful with this collection. And then I have a few books that you might own, and so I looked through those to see what patterns could work in the books as well. So lots of ideas and inspiration coming, whether you're using this fat quarter bundle or you have a bundle of about 20 that focus on 2 colors, in this case, blue and cream. So the criteria I used when selecting patterns is I wanted them to showcase the beautiful fabric. There's different scales and size prints in this collection. And I also wanted it to be able to use approximately 20 fat quarters. Now, there are some where you might need to buy an extra half yard or so, or purchase a single fat quarter to have just enough. But most of these, this will be plenty. This does not include background fabrics, accent fabrics, sashing, borders, backing, binding, all that kind of stuff. This is just the main focus of the blocks. So keep that in mind. You might need to buy additional yardage, but this should build the blocks. So we've waited long enough. At least I know I have. I'm ready to break into this and look at the fabrics up close. All right, here we go. I'm going to attempt to put it back together nicely, so I'm going to try to save the ribbon. All right, so this first print is really the one that made me want to look into the history of blue and white ceramics, because, like I said, I was used to the kind of Dutch themed blue and white pottery and hadn't really seen this kind of motif with lots of animals. There's elephants, monkeys, different kinds of birds, there's pagodas. And so it just made me wonder about the history of this kind of print. And I found out that the pottery that I was used to, the Dutch pottery, is called Delftware, and that came about in the 17th century. And it was made to recreate Chinese porcelain. So that, I think, is where these images come from. The history of blue and white pottery I was reading can be traced all the way back to the Tang Dynasty from the year 618 to 906. And it wasn't until about the 16th century that it arrived in Europe, and Europeans were just fascinated by the exotic animals, and they blended the Asian artistry of making the porcelain pieces with the animals. And so I just thought that was an interesting history, and I'll put a link from a museum that I was reading about this in the description in case you want to learn more. And so I was just curious about the imagery on here and thought it was fun to learn a little bit more about the history. And then the next several pieces feature different scaled floral prints. There's that vase with the flowers and then another bird in there. So that seems to be a common feature in a lot of these prints. Then there's a kind of medium blue floral. I love this one with the roses. This just looks very country vintage to me. And then this one has additional colors. And I think this one is important to point out because you're going to see some patterns where if you use all your fat quarters or most of them, including your cream ones, you might not want a cream background if you want your blocks to pop against the background. And so looking at some of these other colors in here, like this seafoam green, or there's different shades of pink, even the deeper red, those might make some good background fabrics, whether it's a solid or a low volume with these colors in it, just to make the rest of the collection really stand out. But prints like this really deserve patterns that allow you to showcase larger scale prints like this. And so I made sure to include some patterns in the list that do just that. And then we have another blue. This one's a little lighter. I love there's a tiny white dot in the background here. And then this looks like it might be this print here, just all blue and white, different shades of blue. But yeah, this is a bigger print again. It's got some hydrangeas in there, so maybe the flowers are a little different. Yeah, they're not quite the same, but similar idea though, with just a large bouquet of flowers. Oh, this one's really pretty. This reminds me of her hibernation line. It came in like some purples and I think some deeper blues, but very similar style. Oh, and here's these darling little roses, a little more color in this one. And we have another similar, just all blue, different shades of blue with a smaller floral. And here's the dark blue version of this one. Has the birds and looks like little dragonflies perhaps. Darker version of this one. So you can see there's different shades of blue. So really there's some patterns that I found where you can play with that value, maybe going from light to dark. And then here's another, the roses. So I think that one is that guy's match there. There's another main floral print with the dark blue background. And I know this one is going to be a popular backing. If you're looking to get a backing in this line, I'm sure this one will go quickly. And then another darker version. Oh, here's the floral that has the hydrangea in it. So there are two distinct larger bouquets. So that is like this one. Make sure they're still showing up here. Just a few more. So I've got this one, kind of still a medium blue, but this time the florals are light blue instead of cream. And another one of those cute little rose prints. And finally, just like it started, it has those animals and pagodas, that kind of Asian inspired print, but with blues and light blues in here. So very pretty. So there you have all 20 of the fat quarters. Like I said, 7 that are kind of this cream off-white color, and then 13 that are different shades of blue. Mostly I would say medium to dark blues. As far as matching a solid, if you wanted that kind of off-white color, I've heard that the Kona Snow is a good match to this. And as you'll see when I kind of play with a pattern in the fabric I have, Tilda's Dove White, I think, would also look good with this collection. But lots of different blue options to play with. So now that we've seen all the fabrics in this fat quarter bundle, let's look at some patterns that could work well to really highlight these beautiful prints. The first quilt pattern I'm going to share is called Brightly by Cluck Cluck Sew, and it uses layer cakes or fat quarters. There's directions for both in the pattern. Now, if you want to make the throw size, it's 60 inches by 72 inches, and it uses 13 fat quarters. So you could use all your blue fat quarters in the bundle. Maybe use some of your cream ones to make the centers if you wanted. Or if you wanted to do the twin size, which is 72 by 96 inches, it would take all 20 of your fat quarters. Now, if I were to do that, I would probably make the background fabric, which they have as white in their quilt top, a different color that would just contrast with the blues and creams. But you could certainly do that if you wanted a larger size. This quilt makes 12-inch square finished blocks. This next pattern is called Country Bunnies by the Pattern Basket, and it makes a quilt that is 61.5 by 74.5 inches and requires 16 fat quarters to make the bunnies. Now, you could use a mix of blue and cream bunnies, and I think that would just be adorable. If you did that, I would avoid using a cream background just to make sure that those cream bunnies stand out. Take a look at this Thimble Blossoms pattern called Lucky Day. It uses fat eighths or fat quarters if you do the quilt top that's in the back where it's all reds and whites. And that's the one I would use for this fat quarter bundle with something blue. It makes a 72 by 72 inch square quilt. And so if you're going to do an all blue version, it would take 13 fat quarters. So anywhere where it says red fat quarters, just use your blue ones. And there are exactly 13 blue ones in this fat quarter bundle. So this would be a nice option. The Sassy 9 patch pattern by Missouri Star Quilt Company is meant to be made with layer cake squares, those 10-inch squares, but you would have enough of your blue fat quarters to cut into 10-inch pieces to make this quilt top. It's 60 and a half by 72 and a half inches. And again, you can see that it's a red and white quilt, but you could swap out all the red fabrics for your blue. And the final paid pattern I'm going to share is called Sparrows by Pen and Paper Patterns. This makes a 65 and a half by 71 inch quilt top, and it only needs 8 fat quarters. Now you will need fabric for the beak and tail feathers, arrows, and eyes, but you could do a mix of those cream and blue fabrics to make the main body of the birds. If you did that, I would just avoid using a cream background so that your birds don't blend in with it. Or you could do a mix of blues, just some of the medium and lighter shades, just to give some contrast in the birds. But I think it would be really cute adding some of the cream fabrics in the birds. I've actually made this pattern. I've shared it in a couple other videos. I gave piecing tips for how to make this one. And I used the With a Flourish fat quarter bundle, and it turned out really adorable. It's one of my favorite quilts using a denim blue background. Moving on to the free patterns, I'm going to share these in alphabetical order here so they'll be easier to find when I link them in the description below. The first one is a Riley Blake Designs pattern called Earth and Sky. And this one is 57 and a half by 75 and a half inches. And it uses 12 fat quarters. And I like this one because it's mostly just half square triangles and 4 patches. So it should be pretty straightforward to piece. Next, we have another Riley Blake Designs pattern called Farmer's Market. And this quilt top is 58 by 67 inches. It makes 8-inch blocks, and it requires 30 layer cake squares or 10-inch squares. So you could get that using 15 of your fat quarters and still have fabric from each fat quarter left. Now, if you did that, you'd have to use some of your creams. So if you look at their picture here, I would avoid using cream for the sashing or those navy little corner pieces and corner stones that they have that go between each block. So if you choose some different colors for those, it'll make your blues and your creams stand out. Fat Quarter Blooms, which is a free pattern by Fat Quarter Shop, is another one that fits the bill just right. It is a 66 and a half by 86 and a half inch quilt top, and it uses 12 fat quarters. So you could use all your blue fat quarters and still have one left over. Then you just need a background fabric. So you could find a cream fabric that looks good with the creams in this bundle, and it would look just beautiful. This one also looks very beginner friendly. Another free option from Fat Quarter Shop is the Fat Quarter Color Weave pattern, which is 62 and a half by 84 and a half inches and also uses 12 fat quarters. And I think this one would be nice, just kind of transitioning from your lighter blues to your medium and just really playing with those blue values as you move up and down the quilt. This next pattern has a great blog post that really breaks down how to make it, and the pattern itself has lots of photographs of each step. It's called Floating Squares by Carried Away Quilting and makes a quilt top that is 68 and a half by 77 and a half inches, and it's made out of economy blocks. So just the cover quilt alone in the blues and creams can give you an idea of what it could look like with your something blue fat quarter bundle. Now I will say this one requires 21 fat quarters, so you would need one extra fat quarter. And remember, you can use a half yard and cut it in half to make two fat quarters. So if you got just a little extra yardage along with your bundle, you could make this quilt. Night and Day is a fun looking pattern from Fat Quarter Shop. It is 50.5 by 60.5 inches, so a bit smaller. It uses 15 fat quarters, so you might want to break into your cream fat quarters for this one. And if you do that, I would avoid using a cream background, but you could pull it off with a mix of blues and creams, or you could get another half yard of a blue, cut it in half, and you'll get those extra 2 blue fat quarters that you'd need for a total of 15. As you can see, this next one is already made of blues and creams, and it's just gorgeous. It's called Penelope Rose by Riley Blake Designs, and it makes a top that's 44.5 by 55.5, so a little on the smaller side. And in this pattern, you'll be making half square triangles and quarter square triangles. It uses 22 fat quarters. So again, you'd be shy just 2 fat quarters, and getting a half yard of a fabric in the something blue line, cutting it in half would give you those extra 2 fat quarters. But it is so pretty in those blues and creams. Another option is the Picnic Time Quilt by Fat Quarter Shop. It's 59.5 by 77.5 inches, and it uses 12 fat quarters. So you could use all your blue ones and have one blue one left over. I think the most complicated part of this pattern is just using the sew and flip method. So this one is pretty beginner friendly. Art Gallery Fabrics have many free patterns on their website. I chose this one called Plenum, which is 56.5 by 65.5 inches, because it uses 12 fat quarters. So you'd be making a lot of flying geese in this, but you could use 12 of your blue ones, and I think it would look lovely. Ruby Red by Riley Blake Designs is a layer cake friendly pattern that uses 18 10-inch squares, but you could easily get those 10-inch squares out of your fat quarter bundle. Now, if you do what they did here with a mix of the reds and creams, you would use your blues and creams, and I would just make those sashing strips that are dark red on the cover a darker blue, maybe a solid that goes well with the something blue line. But these are just squares set on point, and so you'll just have your triangle setting pieces, which are simple enough to make, and you just assemble them in rows that go diagonally. So this should be a really pretty, stunning quilt, but pieced very simply. The ruby red pattern would also be great to showcase the fabrics with larger prints, because you are making 9.5-inch blocks. So if you wanted to use some of those larger main floral prints, this would definitely be a good one to use. The final free pattern that I'm going to share is called Spellbound by Urban Chicks, and this makes a quilt that is 59 by 76 inches. This one, looking at the fabric requirements, looks like it needs 14 fat quarters and 2 fat eighths, because you can see on the top and bottom of those little kind of diamond shapes, there's just a half of the diamond. So on theirs, it's light blue at the top and a light yellow before going into the border. So you could just use another fat quarter and cut it in half, and you'd have your fat eights. You'd have 2 of them. So for this one, if you wanted to use all your blues, you would need a little bit more yardage, because you only have 13 fat quarters. So you could get another half yard, and that would give you your 14th blue, and then take that additional fat quarter that it would make cut it in half to get your 2 fat-8ths, if that makes sense. So you'd come very close. You'd just need another half yard of blue fabric. Or you could do a mix of your blues and creams, and then for what they use around each diamond, they have that cream colored fabric. I would just pick a contrasting color that, maybe one of the pinks or one of the greens that are mixed into the main floral print. But this would be another really pretty one to play with value as you move from top to bottom. Gives the quilt a lot of movement. Before I share my plan for my Something Blue Fat Quarter bundle, I did want to share some patterns that I found in some books that I own, because these books might be worth getting, and they feature a lot of patterns that work well with just one main color, whether it be blue or red. So I'm going to share those patterns with you now from those books. So in addition to some standalone patterns, I had a few books that I had looked through and thought, if you have these books, you might use these patterns for your Something Blue Fat Quarter bundle. There are lots of great patterns in here. I was looking for the one specifically that would work with this fat quarter bundle that has the 13 blue prints and the 7 cream prints. So A Season in Blue, 16 quilt patterns and a cozy cabin full of inspiration by Aditya Satar of Laundry Basket Quilts has lots of great patterns in here. And I'm going to be using a piece of paper to cover directions and everything. I'm just going to show the pictures and just talk about some of the fat quarter combinations you might use. All right, this first one is great if you're not afraid of template piecing and applique, but the number of fat quarters is just about in the right spot. It's called Blooming Star, and it's 60 inches by 75 inches. It takes 15 blue fat quarters and 6 light fat quarters. So you'd have all the light ones. You would need 2 additional fat quarters, which you could get out of a half yard if you purchased a half yard of another blue. Or if you wanted them to be different, you'd need 2 additional fat quarters. But this one's just gorgeous if you're willing to take on some different techniques. This next one is called Crystal Ball. It's 59 by 59 inches, and it also requires template piecing. I just selected it because it has lots of large blue pieces and lighter cream pieces, so it would really highlight some of those bigger prints. Now, this one has fat-8ths as the requirement, but remember, a fat-8th is just half of a fat quarter. So it requires 25 fat-8ths. So that's 12 and a half fat quarters, which you'd have in this bundle. Now, it does require 24 of the cream prints in fat-8ths, which would be 12 fat quarters. So you would need 5 additional fat quarters in the cream print. This quilt is called Maze. It's 88 and a half by 88 and a half inches. And this one almost hits the mark perfectly with the number of fat quarters required. It does require additional yardage for some of the setting triangles and the borders and such. But it takes 12 blue fat quarters, which you would have, and then 8 of the cream fat quarters. And so you'd just be 1 short there if you could come up with 1 more fat quarter. So this is definitely a good option. Very pretty and just symmetrical. It's very pleasing to the eye. This one is actually called Something Blue, and it's 56 and a half by 72 and a half inches. And there are lots of just squares in here, and then the large cream squares in the middle that would lend itself to showing off the prints. The fabric requirements actually ask for layer cake squares, or those 10-inch squares, but you would have enough with your fat quarter bundle. You are cutting mostly 5-inch squares or less out of your layer cake squares, and so you could easily do that with your fat quarters. So I wanted to throw that in, even though it doesn't say fat quarters in the fabric requirements, you would have enough yardage for this one. And finally, Sky and Sea you would definitely have enough for. It's 40.5 inches by 48.5 inches, and it only requires 5 blue fat quarters. Now it does say 1.5 yards of your background fabric, so they're using the same fabric, but you could use your fat quarters to give it a more scrappy look. So 1.5 yards would be the same as 3 fat quarters. So you could take 3 of your cream fat quarters that you have in your bundle and just do a scrappier look. Or if you want it to look more like this, then just get 1.5 yards of your background fabric. This is just an honorable mention because it is not really a fat quarter friendly pattern, but it has the blues, and I just think it's a gorgeous pattern. This is on my wish list to make someday, the Alaska quilt. It's 71.5 by 71.5 inches, and it takes just a few yards of different blues, and then you have a few different creams. So you could definitely use this line for this quilt. It's just not going to lend itself to your fat quarter bundle. But I just wanted to mention it because it's so beautiful and would tie in the colors well. If you happen to have this book, Blue and White Quilts, 13 Remarkable Quilts with Timeless Appeal by Martingale, I know they're no longer publishing, but if you have this book or there's still copies out there, this has a lot of blue and white quilts, as it says, which this fat quarter bundle is. Most of them, though, are just one blue fabric, and it's mostly yardage based. So there was one pattern in here that I thought would look good with this fat quarter bundle and the more scrappy look with the mix of fabrics. So this pattern is found on page 28. It's called To the Nines by Camille Ross Skelly, and it's 63.5 by 75.5 inches finished. It requires 15 fat quarters in blue. And so there's 13, so you'd need to get 2 more fat quarters or another half yard of the blue fabric, and a fabric of your choice. And then it takes 4 1/8 yards of just a white background in this one. So you wouldn't be using your cream fat quarters, but you'd get to use all your blues, and then you just need a couple more. So that's the only one that really stood out to me in the Blue and White Quilts book, if you happen to have it. I also have the book Red and White Quilts, 14 Quilts with Timeless Appeal from Today's Top Designers, also by Martingale. And so just because it says red and white doesn't mean that's what you have to use. In fact, I made this quilt. This is the one I showed earlier, my blue and white quilt called Daydream. This is a 70 by 70 inch quilt, another pattern by Camille Ross Skelly, and it requires 20 fat quarters in whatever color you're using. So for this one, you would need 7 more blue fat quarters to make this work, or you could, because it's a 20 fat quarter bundle, instead of all blue, you could use your blue and whites and then change the background to something that the white could pop against. So looking at this, there are some pinks in here, or there's this kind of sea foam green. So you could, instead of doing a white background, you could pick maybe one of those pink or soft green colors and make that the background, and then where all the white is, and then your whites and blues would pop against it. So I just thought I'd mention that one because you could use all 20 of your fat quarters if you do it that way. This was a fun quilt to piece, and it was the first one I feel like where I was really working on getting my points to not be cut off and really practice sewing right to the side of those intersection points, so when you press, they're nice and crisp. So I thought I'd mention that one if you have this book. And that brings me to my final book and the pattern that I decided I'm going to use for my fat quarter bundle. And so this comes from Red and White Quilts 2, 14 Quilts with Everlasting Appeal. And it's also by Martingale Publishing. And the quilt I decided to do is called Unchained Melody by Susan Aki. It's 83.5 by 83.5 inches, and I just think it is beautiful. Most of the quilts in this book, just like the other blue and white and red and white book I showed you, are mostly just one print of red and then one background color. This one allows you to use scrappy whites and scrappy reds, and it will work just fine with the fat quarter bundle that I have, but I did need to get some additional yardage. So let me show you what I got. So I have my notes that are just little sticky notes I keep on the pages, and I kind of test out the dimensions of the pieces I need to cut, make sure they'll work with the fat quarters, see if I need anything additional. And this fat quarter bundle will work with a little bit of additional fabric. So the pattern requires 16 assorted reds. Anything that says red, I'm going to switch to blue. And of course, there's only 13 blues in this bundle. So I need 3 more. So I ended up getting 2 additional half yards. That would be 4 fat quarters that come from the line. And I got them through Missouri Star Quilt Company. And the nice thing about the way they package their fabric is they put a sticker with the name of the fabric and how much you got. So it's already labeled for you. Now, unfortunately, it is a lot of plastic, and I'm going to try to move it around just because I know there can be a glare on plastic. But I ended up getting some bush bloom cornflower, half yard of that, and Carol cornflower yardage, another half yard of that. So I really like these kind of medium blues that were in the line. So I can get my extra 3 fat quarters out of those 2. And then I don't have this quite yet. I have a few Moda bolts of their Bella Solid, some off-white, some creams and ivories, and none of them I thought looked that great with it. Like I held up this yardage that's already out of the bag, and it was either making this look dingy because it was too white, or it just still clashed. It was too cream. So the project I'm currently putting together uses Tilda Dove White, and this is just a bit that I have left from it. So I have my scraps and remnants, and I think this looks beautiful. So I'm going to get more of the Tilda Dove White. And so I'll see what I have left. Maybe I won't quite need 3 1/3 yards. I still have, probably at least 1/3 of a yard, but that's going to be the background fabric that I use. I think that'll look very nice. So I'm going to go a little off script here for the gingham. So if you look at the picture, it almost looks pink because it's a white and red gingham that surrounds all these star blocks. And so I wanted something that still reads pretty blue, but also has enough white in it that it kind of looks like a very light blue. So to kind of have that same gingham effect, but they don't have a gingham in this print. So what I'm going to use instead is this Clara May blue yardage. And I think I'm going to fussy cut it. I'm going to decide, maybe play with it if I want to fussy cut it where these florals are in the middle and then these little scalloped edges and maybe some of the stripe are on the outside. Or maybe I want to do away with the florals and just focus on the stripe and scalloped edge where the florals might be more in the seam allowance. So this one is going to take some fussy cutting. So I ended up getting more than I needed. It requires 2 1/8 yards, and I got 2 1/4, so just a little more. It gives me some wiggle room. Plus, Missouri Star, you have to order at least a half yard, I believe, and then you can go up by quarter yard increments. So that gives me a little extra to play with and do some fussy cutting. But I thought I would try that for the gingham portion. Okay, next it wants 16 fat eighths in those light prints. And again, fat eighths are a half a fat quarter. So I really just need 8 fat quarters, and I only have 7 in the bundle. So I got a few more options, this is more than what I need because, like I said, I just need one extra. So, but I thought I just wanted to mix it up a little and see what I liked. This isn't actually in the line, but it's a blender that matches the line. So it's the Something Blue Dorothy Sky Yardage. So it's not in the bundle, but the blue works beautifully with the line. And then I also got the Something Blue Noel Blue Yardage. That's really pretty. I was trying to go for kind of a little more low volume. Some of the whites with the blues have much bolder prints, like that one, for example. I wanted to pick fabrics that had a lot more white for the background. And so this one here is really cute. It's called First Kiss Cream Yardage. And then I opened this one to test against my background fabrics, but this one is just called Carol Pale Blue Yardage. And I think this is one of my favorites. I just like the blue color in there. So I'll definitely have extra, but I can get what I need to finish off the cream backgrounds. And I just thought this would give me a little more variety to make it look scrappier. Okay, this pattern also wants 3/4 yards of a solid, which they're using for these little crosses, the outsides of the crosses. And so instead of going with a solid, I just opted for a dark dot that looks like this. So I'll use this one and then change the centers because this dot is also not in the line. So anything I use for the center won't match. But it's the Something Blue Dorothy Night Yardage. So I got 3/4 of a yard of that. You can see it really looks good with the darker prints in the bundle. And finally, for the sashing, outer border, and binding, I got 2.5 yards of the Wild Garden Night Yardage. So this is a larger print, very pretty one. When I went online to pre-order, a lot of the large floral prints were already gone. But I really am happy that this one was still available. I know there's some that have the color in it, like these ones. But I really am drawn to this just blue and white. So I'm happy I was able to secure some of this for the borders. So the only thing I didn't get was the backing. And of course, now I know I need to get some more background color. But I think this is just going to look lovely. And it's something I look forward to putting together soon. So I'll be sure to update how it's coming along. All right, I hope this video has provided you with lots of ideas. If you have the Something Blue collection or a similar collection that features just a couple colors, and if you have a different pattern in mind or know one that would work well with this collection, feel free to share it in the comments. It can be a great resource for people who are just overwhelmed by the number of options that are out there. So I hope this was helpful and that I can start stitching up some of the blocks for the Unchained Melody quilt this summer. I look forward to using this fabric soon. In the meantime, I also have a lot of summer projects that I plan on working on, so watch for some update videos to see how I'm progressing on those. But as always, I appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd love to have you come visit me regularly, and I will see you next time. Take care.